Rain hammered the tin roof of the bus shelter, drowning out the sluggish rumble of the idling sedan. Through the fogged glass, his silhouette was a jagged smear of panic and arrogance. Last time throwing myself at that passenger door had been instinct. I begged, scraped my knees on the gravel, and tore my fingernails to the quick, trying to keep him from leaving. It ruined me. This time, I zipped my damp jacket up to my chin, took a sip of bitter, lukewarm coffee, and watched him seal his own fate. Freezing water soaked through the canvas of my sneakers, pooling coldly around my toes. That was the first sensation. Not the buzzing neon open sign of the roadside diner, not the rhythmic hollow ticking of the sedan's cooling engine block, but the biting dirty water of a pothole seeping into my socks. I blinked against the stinging downpour. The sudden shift in reality felt like being dragged upward from the bottom of a frozen lake. Seconds ago, I was 42, lying in a sterile hospice bed, my lungs giving out after 2 decades of grinding poverty and stress-induced illness. Now I was 24 again. The air tasted like wet asphalt ozone and cheap, stale tobacco. Tristan stood 3 feet away. His leather jacket was slick with rain clinging to the shoulders I used to think could carry the world. The erratic twitch in his jaw, a tell he only ever displayed when backed into a corner, worked furiously beneath his wet skin. He gripped a heavy canvas duffel bag in one hand, the knuckles white and straining. In the other, the silver keys to the old Mustang dangled, catching the sickly yellow glow of the street lamp. "Move!" His voice wasn't the smooth, practiced hum that charmed investors and judges. It was a guttural bark edged with animal panic. In the life I had just left behind, this exact moment was the fulcrum of my destruction. Back then, I didn't know the duffel bag was stuffed with stolen bearer bonds and falsified ledgers from the firm. I only knew he was frantic, that the police were likely already on their way, and that he was too drunk, too manic to navigate the winding, unlit mountain pass ahead. In that past life I had screamed. I had thrown my weight against the driver's side door, wrestling him for the keys, crying until my throat bled. Because of my interference, the police arrived before he could start the engine. Because of my interference, he had the time to quietly slip the flash drive containing the forged signatures into my purse while the officers cuffed him. He played the victim. He played the manipulated lover. I spent 8 years in a federal facility for corporate fraud and another 12 scrubbing floors to pay off the restitution while he cut a deal turned state's evidence, and lived comfortably on a sun-bleached coast. My chest rose and fell. The cold air burned my lungs, grounding me in the present. I wasn't dead. I was here shivering in the rain, staring at the architect of my ruin. I said, "Move, damn it." Tristan took a step forward, his boot splashing muddy water against my jeans. He smelled of sour whiskey and fear. It was intoxicatingly pathetic. A strange, hollow calm settled over me. It wasn't the fiery, righteous vengeance they sell in movies. It was heavy. It felt like lead in my bones. I looked at his face, really looked at it, past the handsome symmetry that had blinded me in my youth. I saw the weakness around his eyes, the absolute cowardice in his tight, bloodless lips. My hands shoved deep into my coat pockets, curled into tight fists. I forced my fingers to relax, unspooling the tension joint by joint. "Okay," I said. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, flat scraped clean of the desperate affection that used to color my every word to him. Tristan blinked. The twitch in his jaw paused. For a fraction of a second, confusion breached his panic. He was geared up for a fight, braced for my usual hysterical loyalty. The sudden lack of resistance unbalanced him. What he snapped, squinting through the curtain of rain. I took a slow, deliberate step backward. The wet gravel crunched loud and sharp beneath my shoes. I moved out of the path of the driver's side door. "Go," I said. He didn't hesitate. Survival instinct overrode his confusion. He lunged for the handle, wrenched the heavy door open, and threw the duffel bag across the center console. The hinges screamed a rusty metallic shriek that echoed off the damp bricks of the diner behind me. He folded his tall frame into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. The glass was fogged, but I could see the frantic, jerky movements of his silhouette as he jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over with a choked sputter, hesitated, and then roared to life, a violent, guttural sound that rattled my teeth. He didn't roll down the window. He didn't offer a final apologetic glance. He threw the car into drive. The rear tires spun on the slick pavement, spitting a spray of dirty water and loose rocks against my shins before finding purchase. I stood perfectly still in the downpour, the cold finally seeping past my skin and settling into my marrow. I watched the dull red tail lights shrink as the car fishtailed onto the main road, heading straight for the switchbacks of Dead Man's Curve. He hadn't checked the brake lines. I knew that for a fact. He had been putting it off for 3 weeks, claiming the mechanic was trying to rip him off. With a belly full of cheap whiskey, a trunk loaded with stolen futures, and worn brake pads on a road slick with engine oil and heavy rain, Tristan was driving a casket. I didn't stop him. I didn't even raise my voice. I just let the dark swallow him whole. Red tail lights bled into the surrounding pitch-black twin crimson smudges quickly erased by the relentless grey sheet of the storm. The heavy roar of the V8 engine faded into a distant, angry drone, leaving only the sound of rain drumming heavily against the asphalt and the dull hum of the diner's neon sign. I stood there for a long time. Water dripped from my eyelashes, blurring my vision. My coat weighed 10 pounds heavier, soaked through to the cheap fleece lining. I waited for the guilt to hit. I braced myself for the sickening plunge of regret, the ingrained, pathetic urge to run after him, to flag down a passing car, to do something, anything, to save him from himself. Nothing came. Instead, a quiet, almost ugly satisfaction unfurled in the pit of my stomach. It tasted like copper and old blood. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't even a good person, not anymore. The decades of scrubbing toilets in halfway houses, of eating cold beans out of dented cans while my lungs decayed, had burned the altruism right out of me. Slowly I turned my back on the empty road. The bell above the diner door jingled a cheerful, tinny sound that violently contrasted with the cold graveyard of my thoughts. The rush of heated air hit me like a physical blow. It smelled of scorched coffee fryer grease and industrial lemon cleaner. Only 2 booths were occupied. At the far end, an elderly man in a trucker hat was methodically cutting a rubbery-looking steak. Near the register, the waitress, a woman named Nora, whose name tag hung crookedly over her stained apron, looked up from her crossword puzzle. She took in my dripping hair, my pale face, and the puddle rapidly forming around my feet. "Honey, you look like half-drowned roadkill." Nora rasped, her voice thick from years of unfiltered cigarettes. She grabbed a clean, rough-spun towel from beneath the counter and tossed it to me. "Your boyfriend finally take off," I caught the towel. The terry cloth was warm, fresh from the dryer. It was a small, agonizingly mundane comfort. "He's not my boyfriend," I said, drying my face. The friction sent a necessary spark of pain across my numb cheeks. Not anymore. I walked over to a booth by the window, the vinyl seat squeaking loudly in protest as I slid in. The table was sticky, smeared with the ghost of maple syrup. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass pane, staring out into the dark. "Coffee?" Nora asked, already standing beside the table with a scuffed glass carafe. "Black, and a slice of the cherry pie." "Whatever's left." She nodded, pouring the tar-black liquid into a heavy ceramic mug. "Suit yourself. But you're going to be waiting a while if you think he's circling back." The storm's washing out the lower pass. I wrapped both hands around the mug, letting the scalding heat burn the chill from my palms. "He's not coming back." Nora gave me a long, appraising look before shuffling back to the counter. I lifted the mug to my lips. The coffee was terrible burnt acidic and sitting on the burner for at least 4 hours. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. Tick, tick, tick. The large clock above the kitchen doors aggressively marked the passing seconds. 15 minutes had gone by. Tristan would be hitting the sharpest incline right about now. He'd be accelerating his paranoia, convincing him the flashing lights of the police were right behind him, even though the precinct was 20 miles away in the opposite direction. He would hit the steep descent tap, the brakes, to take the hairpin turn, and feel the terrifying empty slack of the pedal hitting the floorboard. My jaw clenched. I took another slow sip of coffee. I remembered his trial. I remembered the perfectly tailored suit he wore, bought with the money he had hidden before the audit. I remembered the way he looked at the jury, his eyes welling with crocodile tears as he pointed a shaking finger at me, calling me the mastermind, the manipulator, the woman who had driven him to ruin. A sharp, shrill sound cut through the steady drumming of the rain. I stopped breathing. The diner went deadly quiet. Even the trucker stopped chewing. Far off in the distance, barely audible over the storm, came the rising, frantic wail of sirens. It started as a faint whine, then multiplied, layering into a chorus of emergency vehicles, tearing down the highway towards the mountain pass. Nora walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness. Lord have mercy. Sounds like a bad one. I stared down at my untouched cherry pie. The bright red filling bled into the flaky crust, thick and gelatinous under the fluorescent lights. My hands began to shake. Not from sorrow, not from grief, from the sudden violent release of a 20-year sentence. The sirens grew louder, tearing through the night. The flashing red and blue lights briefly reflected in the puddles outside the window, painting the wet pavement in frantic strokes of color. Karma wasn't a cosmic scale balancing good and evil. Karma was just gravity. It was worn brake pads, wet asphalt, and the inevitable consequence of a man who thought he could outrun his own shadow. I picked up my fork, broke off a piece of the crust, and put it in my mouth. I was going to need to figure out how to live again. But tonight, I was just going to finish my pie. Flashing blue and red lights cut violently through the diner's blinds, painting the sticky vinyl of my booth in jagged, rhythmic strokes. The rain was still coming down in sheets, but the wail of sirens had died, replaced by the low, urgent crackle of police radios. 2 officers walked through the front door. They brought the storm in with them. Water pooled off their heavy, dark, yellow slickers, hitting the linoleum with heavy, distinct slaps. The smell of wet wool, damp leather, and sweat instantly overpowered the diner's scent of old fryer grease. I didn't look up from my empty plate. The crust of the cherry pie was gone. Only a smear of red syrup remained, looking entirely too much like the blood currently washing off the tarmac a few miles up the pass. "Miss," the voice was rough-tired. I slowly lifted my head. The officer standing over me was young, maybe 30, but his eyes carried the heavy, bruised weight of someone who had just looked inside a crushed tin can and seen the meat left behind. A brass nameplate on his chest read, "Higgins, Nora said you came in from the rain about an hour ago." Higgins said, pointing a thumb back towards the waitress who was watching us with wide, owl-like eyes behind the counter. "Said your partner left in a dark blue Mustang." "He's not my partner," I murmured. My vocal cords felt tight, raspy. It wasn't entirely an act. The sheer adrenaline of rewriting my own timeline was beginning to crash, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug. It was lukewarm now, the ceramic barely retaining any heat. "Right." Higgins pulled a small, weatherproof notepad from his chest pocket. The pages were warped from the damp. "Can I get your name, please?" "Sadie. Sadie Miller." "Okay, Sadie. Can you tell me where he was headed?" I looked Higgins in the eye. In my past life, this was the moment I fell apart. I had hyperventilated, screamed at them to save him, confessed that he was running, and practically handed them the rope they used to hang me. The memory of the rough, scratchy blanket in my holding cell flared in the back of my mind. The taste of powdered eggs and rusted pipes coated my tongue. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I let my shoulders slump, perfectly mimicking the exhausted posture of a girl who had just been dumped on the side of a highway. "He just told me to get out. We had a fight. He was drinking." Higgins stopped writing. His jaw tightened. He shared a brief, loaded look with his older partner standing near the door. "He kicked you out of the car. He said I was dead weight." The lie slipped out so smoothly it tasted like butter. It was, after all, something Tristan had told me plenty of times before. He grabbed his duffel bag from the trunk, threw it in the front seat, and just left. "Is he okay? Did he get pulled over?" The older cop stepped forward. His boots squeaked loudly against the wet floor. "Miss Miller, there was an accident about 3 miles up the pass. Dead Man's Curve. The vehicle breached the guardrail and went down the embankment." A thick, suffocating silence settled over the diner. Even the heavy ticking of the wall clock seemed to hold its breath. I forced a shallow gasp, bringing a trembling hand up to cover my mouth. My heart rate didn't spike. My palms weren't sweating. I felt nothing but a dark, terrifying relief. "Is he? Paramedics are extracting him now." The older cop said, his tone softening a fraction. "It's a bad wreck. The car is completely totaled. Do you know if he was transporting anything dangerous? We found a significant amount of cash and documents scattered in the brush. The rain is making a mess of it. The ledger, the bearer bonds, and most importantly, the silver flash drive with the forged signatures. In the timeline I had left behind, that flash drive was sitting at the bottom of my purse, planted there by Tristan in the 30 seconds before the cops cuffed him at the gas station. It was the sole piece of physical evidence that tied me to the embezzlement. "No," I whispered, forcing a tear to finally well up and spill over my lashes. The salt burned my cold cheek. "No, he just said he was going on a business trip. He works for a wealth management firm in the city. I don't understand." Higgins sighed, closing his notepad. "We're going to need you to come down to the station, Sadie, just to make a formal statement. We'll get you a ride, get you out of those wet clothes." "Okay." I stood up. My damp jeans clung to my thighs, the fabric stiff and uncomfortable. As I followed the officers out into the biting wind of the storm, I didn't look back at the diner. The trap was sprung. The evidence was in the mud right next to his blood. I was finally truly out of the cage. Morning broke with a harsh, unforgiving glare. The storm had passed, leaving the world scrubbed raw and blindingly bright. The waiting room of St. Jude's Memorial Hospital smelled aggressively of industrial bleach and stale, burnt coffee. It was a sterile, unforgiving scent that instantly transported me back to the prison infirmary, where I had spent 2 weeks coughing up blood from an untreated chest infection. I sat in a stiff, plastic-molded chair, my spine rigid, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor. Karma, I had learned in the last 12 hours, wasn't a neat and tidy executioner. It was a butcher. Tristan didn't die on the mountain. He had been thrown from the vehicle halfway down the ravine, his body acting as a human plow through the rocks and pine trees. The stolen money he loved so much had rained down around him like useless, bloody confetti. Sharp, frantic clicking echoed down the hallway. High heels, expensive ones. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. The scent of heavy, oppressive gardenia perfume hit the air seconds before she rounded the corner. Beatrice, Tristan's mother. She was a woman constructed entirely of sharp angles and old money. Her silver hair was pulled back into a severe chignon, and her camel hair coat was impeccably tailored, completely at odds with the frantic, red-rimmed panic in her eyes. "Where is he?" She demanded, her voice a shrill whip that made a passing nurse flinch. She spotted me sitting in the corner, her expression twisted from terror into pure, venomous disgust. In my previous life, Beatrice had been the final nail in my coffin. She had hired the best defense attorneys in the state for Tristan and actively funded the media campaign that painted me as a manipulative, gold-digging seductress who forced her precious boy into white-collar crime. I had cowered before her. I had begged for her forgiveness. Not today. I remained seated, crossing my arms over my borrowed, oversized police precinct hoodie. "ICU, bed 4. Beatrice marched toward me, her heels striking the floor like hammers. "What did you do? What happened, Sadie?" You were supposed to be watching him. Watching him. I tilted my head, studying the frantic pulse jumping in her pale throat. He's 28, Beatrice. Not a toddler. He chose to drink half a bottle of scotch and drive on bald tires in a monsoon. She stopped dead, shocked by the flat, lifeless tone of my voice. Her hand twitched, rising instinctively, as if she meant to strike me. You little tramp. I knew you were poison the second he brought you home. The police told me what they found at the wreck. The firm's money. If you think you're pinning your little thieving scheme on my son, I didn't pin anything on anyone. I interrupted, my voice dropping to a low, quiet hum that cut effortlessly through her hysteria. He packed the bags. He drove the car. I was sitting in a diner eating pie. The police have the dashcam footage from the highway toll. They have his fingerprints on the duffel bag, and most importantly, they have the flash drive with his digital footprint all over the forged transfers. Beatrice's face drained of color. The heavy gardenia perfume suddenly smelled sour, masked by the sharp tang of her nervous sweat. She knew. She knew exactly what Tristan was capable of, even if she paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to pretend otherwise. You... She stammered, the patrician mask slipping. You were supposed to be in the car. Yes. I agreed softly. I think that was his plan. Hard to testify against him if I went over the cliff with the evidence. Before she could form a response, the heavy double doors of the surgical wing pushed open. A surgeon in green scrubs stepped out, pulling a paper cap off his head. His eyes were deeply shadowed with exhaustion. Family of Tristan Vance. Wait, the name Vance. I shouldn't think of it. My mind corrected itself. Family of Tristan. The surgeon asked. Beatrice shoved past me, practically throwing herself at the doctor. I'm his mother. How is he? I demand to see him. The surgeon held up a steadying hand, a gesture practiced on thousands of hysterical relatives. Ma'am, please. He's out of surgery, but he is in a medically induced coma. The trauma to his physical form was extensive. What does that mean? Beatrice's voice broke, the sharp edges finally shattering. I stood up slowly, the cheap plastic chair squeaking in protest. I walked over to stand just behind Beatrice's shoulder. His lower spine sustained a massive compression fracture when he was ejected from the vehicle. The doctor explained, his voice gentle but clinical. We've stabilized the vertebrae, but there is significant severing of the spinal cord. I'm very sorry, but he will not regain the use of his legs. Beatrice let out a sound that wasn't human. It was a high, thin keen like a wounded dog. She collapsed against the wall, her expensive coat sliding against the cheap hospital paint. Furthermore, the doctor continued, looking uncomfortably at his clipboard. The facial trauma from the impact required extensive reconstructive plating. His jaw is wired shut. The recovery will be measured in years, not months. Paralyzed, muted, trapped in a broken, agonizing shell, I looked down at Beatrice weeping openly on the sterile floor, clutching her designer purse like a life raft. In my past life, Tristan had lived on a sunny beach, sipping expensive wine, while I rotted in a cell trading my youth for his freedom. Now he was looking at a life sentence inside his own ruined body, waiting for the federal prosecutors to wheel him into a courtroom he couldn't walk into and ask him questions he couldn't speak to answer. I turned my back on the weeping mother and the exhausted surgeon. The heavy double doors of the waiting room hissed open, letting in a blast of cool, crisp morning air. I stepped out of the hospital and took a deep, greedy breath. The air smelled like rain-wet pavement and absolute, terrifying freedom. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the burner phone I had bought at the gas station an hour ago, and dialed a number I had memorized 20 years in the future. It was time to take everything else. 10 digits. I had stared at them on court documents, on restitution paperwork, and on the back of my own eyelids for 20 years. The dial tone against my ear was a sharp electronic drone, devoid of warmth. I stood beneath the flickering moth-swarmed awning of a gas station payphone, the burner cell still in my pocket. Cell towers pinged locations. Payphones at cash-only gas stations on the edge of the county lines didn't. The line clicked. Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Division. Agent Pendleton speaking. Arthur Pendleton. Even over the crackling wire, his voice sounded exactly as it had during my interrogation 2 decades ago, dry, overworked, and heavily caffeinated. In my first life, he had been the man who pushed the plea deal across the table, his eyes full of pity for the stupid, naive girl who had let her boyfriend use her bank accounts to wash stolen capital. "The crash on Highway 9 tonight," I said. I held a crumpled napkin over the mouthpiece to muffle the audio, a trick I'd learned from a cellmate who used to run numbers in Atlantic City. "The driver is Tristan Hayes. He's an asset manager at Oak and Iron Financial." "Who is this?" Pendleton's tone shifted instantly, the administrative boredom vanishing, replaced by the sharp edge of a hunter catching a scent. "If you have information regarding the accident, you need to contact Highway Patrol." Highway Patrol only cares about the skid marks." I interrupted, my voice flat. "You care about the $3.2 million missing from the firm's escrow accounts. Check the Cayman routing numbers associated with a shell corporation called the Archipelago Fund. Hayes set it up 3 months ago. He's been skimming from his top-tier clients and covering the gaps with falsified quarterly reports. The flash drive with the original unedited ledgers was in the vehicle." Silence hung on the line, thick and heavy. "Mom, I'm going to need you to identify yourself," Pendleton said slowly. The sound of a keyboard clacking echoed faintly in the background. He was already running the name. "Check the Archipelago Fund," I repeated, "and tell your team to freeze the assets before the morning bell. If you wait, his mother's lawyers will find a way to bleed the accounts dry and claim it was a clerical error." I didn't wait for a response. I hung the heavy plastic receiver back on the hook. It slammed with a satisfying final thud. The adrenaline that had been carrying me since the diner finally gave out. My knees buckled slightly, the wet pavement rushing up to meet my sneakers. I grabbed the metal edge of the phone booth to steady myself. The nausea hit me in a violent wave, tasting of stale coffee and pure, unadulterated shock. I dragged myself to the cheap $40 a night motel I had booked 2 blocks away. Room 114, the key was physical, a heavy brass thing attached to a chipped plastic diamond. Inside, the room smelled of old cigarette smoke, masked by aggressive industrial pine cleaner. The carpet was a murky, indeterminate brown, sticky in places I didn't want to think about. It was the most beautiful room I had ever seen. I locked the deadbolt, fastened the chain, and walked straight into the cramped bathroom. The fluorescent light above the sink flickered violently before humming to life, casting a sickly green-tinged glow over the mirror. I gripped the edges of the porcelain sink and stared at the stranger looking back at me. There were no deep, bruised bags under her eyes. The skin around her mouth wasn't pulled tight by years of chronic pain and cheap, starchy prison food. Her hair was thick, dark, and damp from the rain, lacking the brittle grey streaks that had aged me prematurely. I raised a hand, turning it over under the harsh light. The skin was smooth. The knuckles weren't swollen with arthritis. The scars from chemical burns earned working in the prison laundry were gone. A ragged, ugly sob tore out of my throat. It wasn't relief. It was grief. I slid down the bathroom door, pulling my knees to my chest, and cried until my ribs ached. I cried for the 42-year-old woman who had died alone in a hospice bed, suffocating on her own failing lungs because she couldn't afford proper medical care. I mourned her. She had endured 2 decades of hell, paying the price for a crime she didn't commit only to be erased. I sat on that cold linoleum floor for hours, the scent of mildew filling my new, healthy lungs. By the time the grey light of dawn crept through the frosted bathroom window, the tears had stopped. The frightened, loyal girl who loved Tristan Hayes was dead. The bitter, dying woman from the future was gone. What remained was something sharp, cold, and entirely hollowed out. I stripped off my damp clothes, turned the shower dial as hot as it would go, and stood under the weak, sputtering spray. The water scalded my skin, washing away the smell of the rain, the diner, and the ghost of Tristan's whiskey-soaked breath. When I stepped out, wrapped in a thin, scratchy towel, I turned on the ancient CRT television bolted to the dresser. The morning news anchor looked grave. Behind her, aerial footage showed a crumpled piece of dark blue metal at the bottom of a rocky ravine. Local financial advisor Tristan Hayes remains in critical condition following a devastating crash on Highway 9 late last night. Authorities have cordoned off the area, and sources say federal investigators have arrived on the scene, though the nature of their involvement remains undisclosed. Pendleton had moved fast. The trap was snapping shut. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, watching the wreckage of my past life loop on the screen. It was time to buy a suit. The FBI would be calling me soon, and I needed to look the part of the perfect, oblivious victim. The federal building downtown was a monument to brutalist architecture, all poured concrete narrow windows and an oppressive, sterile chill that seeped into your bones. The waiting room on the 4th floor smelled exactly as I remembered: ozone from overworked laser printers, floor wax, and stale filter coffee. I sat in a stiff leather chair, tugging nervously at the cuffs of my blazer. I had bought it from a thrift store 2 days ago. It was a muted beige, one size too large, making my shoulders look narrow and my posture naturally slumped. I paired it with a cheap floral blouse that screamed naive administrative assistant. My hands were shaking. I didn't try to stop them. The tremor was genuine, fueled by the visceral memory of sitting in this exact room 20 years ago wearing handcuffs. Letting the fear show was the best camouflage I had. A heavy oak door opened. Agent Pendleton stepped out. He looked younger than he had in my memories, his dark hair only just beginning to salt at the temples. His suit was off the rack, wrinkled at the elbows. He held a thick manila folder, his eyes scanning the empty waiting room before landing on me. Sadie Miller. I jumped slightly, clutching my cheap pleather purse to my chest. Yes, that's me. I'm Agent Pendleton. Thank you for coming in voluntarily. He held the door open, gesturing down the long, fluorescent-lit hallway. We just have a few questions regarding Mr. Hayes. Follow me, please. The interrogation room was painfully standard. A metal table, 2 bolted chairs, a 2-way mirror that no one ever pretended was just a mirror. Pendleton sat across from me, dropping the heavy folder onto the table with a loud, calculated thwack. "Can I get you water, coffee?" he asked, his tone aggressively polite. "Water, please," I whispered. He poured a paper cup from a plastic pitcher and pushed it across the table. I wrapped both hands around it, taking a small, shaking sip. "Miss Miller, I'll cut right to the chase." Pendleton began leaning forward. He didn't open the folder. He just stared at me, analyzing my micro-expressions. Tristan Hayes is under federal investigation for massive corporate fraud. We believe he embezzled millions from his clients. We also know you were with him the night he fled. I didn't know he was fleeing. I stammered, letting my breathing shallow out. I forced my eyes to widen, pooling with unshed tears. We were driving up to the cabin. We got into a fight. He was drinking, he was erratic. He kicked me out at the diner. A fight about what? Pendleton asked sharply. He was paranoid, I said, letting a tear finally spill over. I quickly wiped it away, looking deeply embarrassed. He kept talking about how his mother was breathing down his neck, how the firm didn't appreciate him. He mentioned something about an audit. I told him he was being dramatic, that he needed to sober up. That's when he stopped the car. Pendleton's eyes narrowed slightly. He finally opened the folder. "Miss Miller, you were his live-in girlfriend for 3 years. You're telling me you noticed nothing unusual, no large purchases, no secretive behavior." This was the pivot. The moment where I had to hand them the knife without letting them see my fingerprints on the handle. "He did change his passwords a lot," I offered hesitantly, looking down at my hands. "And he got really angry if I touched his briefcase. A few months ago he was bragging about some new project. He called it the archipelago thing. I thought it was a real estate development. He said it was going to make us rich enough to buy his mother out of our lives." Pendleton froze. The mention of archipelago, the exact word the anonymous caller had given him, was the hook. I saw the muscle in his jaw jump. He was connecting the dots, believing he was pulling the information out of a clueless, traumatized witness. Did he ever give you anything to hold on to documents hardware? Pendleton pushed. No. I shook my head adamantly. Never. He thought I was stupid when it came to numbers. He wouldn't even let me balance our shared checking account. Pendleton stared at me for a long, suffocating minute. The hum of the ventilation system felt deafening. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside was a silver flash drive. It was scratched, smeared with dried mud, but perfectly intact. The air left my lungs. The reaction wasn't fake. Seeing it, the physical object that had stolen 2 decades of my life sent a jolt of pure, freezing terror down my spine. My stomach roiled. I pressed my back hard against the metal chair to keep from visibly recoiling. We recovered this from the wreckage, Pendleton said softly, watching my terror with clinical interest. We haven't decrypted it yet, but we believe it holds the original ledgers. Have you ever seen this before? I forced myself to look at it, to look past the phantom memory of Tristan slipping it into my purse. Yes. I breathed out, my voice genuinely trembling. Where? Pendleton leaned in closer. It was on his keychain, I said, looking up to meet the agent's eyes with absolute, unblinking sincerity. He took it off his keys when he put his bags in the trunk that night. He put it in the front pocket of his leather jacket. He said it was his insurance policy. Pendleton exhaled slowly. He picked up the evidence bag, sliding it back into his pocket. By placing the drive physically on Tristan's person at the time of the crash, I had severed any possible argument Beatrice's lawyers could make about it being planted or belonging to me. Thank you, Miss Miller, Pendleton said, the sharp interrogator edge softening into genuine sympathy. You've been very helpful. You're free to go. I stood up. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to walk to the door. Miss Miller, Pendleton called out just as my hand hit the brass handle. I paused, looking back over my shoulder. For what it's worth? The federal agent said quietly, looking at my cheap suit and trembling hands. I think he did you a favor leaving you at that diner. You dodged a bullet. I offered him a small, broken smile that didn't reach my eyes. I know, Agent Pendleton. I really do. I walked out of the room down the long corridor and pushed through the heavy glass doors of the federal building. The afternoon sun hit my face warm and blinding. The air smelled of exhaust fumes and hot concrete. I took a deep breath, filling my healthy lungs. The ledger was in federal custody. The offshore accounts were frozen. Tristan was trapped in a broken body facing an indictment he couldn't run from. The past was finally dead. It was time to figure out what to do with the future. October arrived with a brutal, biting chill that stripped the trees bare and turned the city pavement a dull, chalky grey. My apartment was a third-floor walk-up above a dry cleaner. The rent was cheap, the radiator clanked like a dying engine, and the air constantly smelled of perchloroethylene and pressed cotton. It was perfect. It was a fortress of anonymity. I worked graveyard shifts doing data entry for a logistics company. The monotonous clatter of the mechanical keyboard, the glowing green text on the black monitor, the stale taste of break-room coffee. It was a deeply mundane routine that anchored me to this new reality. I needed the quiet. The sudden absence of daily survival panic was a shock to my system. I found myself waiting for the other shoe to drop, my shoulders perpetually tense, my ears straining for the sound of a parole officer's heavy knock. The hardest part wasn't the loneliness. It was the phantom illness. My 24-year-old body was healthy, but my brain was still wired to a dying 42-year-old corpse. I would wake up at 3 a.m, sheets drenched in cold sweat, gasping for air that my fully functional lungs were already processing perfectly. I would clutch my chest, waiting for the agonizing, rattling cough that used to leave spots in my vision only to find nothing but the steady, strong thud of a young heart. It was a terrifying psychological jet lag. I had cheated death, but the muscle memory of dying clung to me like a shadow. I was sitting on my fire escape one Tuesday morning, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching the frost melt off the iron rungs. A battered copy of the Daily Herald rested on my lap. The ink was cheap, leaving grey smudges on my fingertips. The headline wasn't on the front page anymore. The Hayes scandal had moved to the business section, a slow, bureaucratic bleed rather than a dramatic explosion. Federal Grand Jury Index Hayes matriarch on conspiracy charges. I traced the harsh block letters with my thumb. The article detailed how Agent Pendleton's task force had methodically dismantled the Archipelago Fund. When they froze Tristan's offshore accounts, the dominoes fell fast. It turned out Beatrice hadn't just been passively benefiting from her son's stolen wealth. She had been actively funneling it through her charitable foundations to avoid taxes. Without Tristan's daily manipulations to keep the plates spinning, the entire structure collapsed under the weight of a forensic audit. I remembered Beatrice in my first life, untouchable, draped in cashmere, dripping with pearls, sitting in the gallery of my trial, with a look of bored contempt as the judge handed down my sentence. She had paid off the right people, buried the right evidence, and sacrificed me on the altar of her family's reputation. A sharp, barking laugh scraped its way out of my throat, startling a pigeon resting on the railing. The article mentioned that Beatrice's primary estate had been seized by the IRS. She was currently out on bail, residing in a rented townhome, her passport confiscated. The impenetrable armor of generational wealth had been completely shattered by a single carefully timed phone call from a payphone. I folded the newspaper, the paper crinkling loudly in the crisp morning air. I didn't feel a rush of euphoric vindication. The satisfaction was there, but it was cold, heavy, and metallic. Ruining Beatrice didn't give me back the decades I had spent scrubbing institutional floors. It didn't erase the memory of the coarse, scratchy prison uniforms or the taste of powdered eggs. Vengeance wasn't a time machine. It was just an equalizer. Later that week I saw her. I was at a discount pharmacy 2 towns over buying generic ibuprofen for a tension headache. The store smelled of cheap lavender soap and dusty linoleum. I was standing in the checkout lane when I heard that voice. The shrill, demanding cadence was unmistakable, even stripped of its usual imperious volume. "I don't understand. The card should work. Run it again." I stepped back behind a cardboard display of breath mints peering through the gap. Beatrice stood at the pharmacy counter. She was still wearing a designer trench coat, but the cuffs were visibly frayed. Her severe, perfectly coiffed silver hair was flat, a dark, natural grey showing at the roots. Her hands, devoid of the massive diamond rings she used to flaunt, shook slightly as she pushed a blue debit card toward the tired-looking pharmacist. "Ma'am, it's declining. I can't give you the medication without payment." The pharmacist said, his tone flat, entirely unimpressed by her pedigree. "Do you know who I am?" Beatrice hissed, the old venom flaring up, but it was weak. A dying ember. "There must be a hold on the account. I just need the blood pressure medication. I'll bring cash tomorrow." "Store policy. No credit, no meds. Step aside, please, there's a line." Beatrice's mouth opened a retort, dying on her lips as she looked around at the flickering fluorescent lights, the scuffed floor, the faces of the tired working-class people waiting behind her. The reality of her new caste system hit her visibly. Her shoulders slumped, the sharp, aristocratic angles of her posture dissolving into the hollow, beaten shape of an old, frightened woman. She snatched the declined card off the counter and hurried out the automatic doors, the harsh wind instantly whipping her unstyled hair across her face. I stood completely still, the cheap plastic bottle of ibuprofen digging into my palm. I could have stepped out. I could have let her see me healthy, free, unburdened. I could have rubbed salt in the wound. But I looked at her, retreating, pathetic silhouette, and I felt absolutely nothing. The hatred that had fueled me through my final days in the hospice was gone, burned out like a dead match. She was just another desperate person in a cheap pharmacy now. I stepped up to the register, paid for my pills in exact change, and walked back out into the cold. The state long-term care facility was located at the end of a bleak industrial road, bordered by chain-link fences and dead brown grass. It didn't have a serene name like St. Jude's or Sunny Pines. It was just the Department of Health and Human Services Annex 4. This was where the system put the bodies that had run out of money. The lobby smelled of boiled cabbage-strong industrial bleach and old urine that no amount of mopping could ever truly erase. The linoleum was peeling at the corners, and the fluorescent lights hummed with a maddening, inconsistent buzz. I signed the visitor log with a cheap chained pen. Sadie Miller. I didn't lie. I didn't need to. Room 412. The receptionist mumbled, not looking up from a worn paperback novel. End of the hall past the nurse's station. My boots clicked softly against the scuffed floor. The sounds of the facility were deeply unsettling, the rhythmic click of ventilators, the occasional low, confused moan from an open doorway, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes. It was a warehouse for the forgotten. In my past life I had scrubbed floors in places exactly like this as a condition of my parole. I knew the texture of the despair baked into these walls. Room 412 was cramped. The walls were painted a sickly institutional pale green. The single window looked out over a cracked parking lot and a rusty dumpster. Tristan was lying in the bed closest to the door. I stopped at the foot of the mattress, resting my hands on the cold metal railing. The shock of seeing him was a physical blow, a sudden constriction in my throat. The handsome, charismatic asset manager who could talk a jury into convicting an innocent woman was entirely gone. His face, rebuilt with titanium plates after the crash, was slightly asymmetrical, pulling his left eye down into a permanent drooping squint. A thick white tracheostomy tube protruded from his throat, attached to a corrugated plastic hose that hissed rhythmically, doing the breathing his paralyzed diaphragm no longer could. His body beneath the thin, starchy blanket was shockingly frail, the muscles atrophied from months of total immobility. His eyes were closed. The monitor beside him beeped a steady, slow, apathetic rhythm. I stood there listening to the machine breathe for him. The air in the room was heavy, suffocating. I thought about the flash drive. I thought about the duffel bag full of stolen money currently locked in a federal evidence vault. I thought about the sheer arrogance of the man who had ordered me out of his car in the freezing rain, entirely confident that he would escape consequence while I took the fall. Tristan's eyelids fluttered. Slowly, heavily, they dragged open. His right eye, the one that hadn't been warped by the reconstructive surgery, focused blindly on the ceiling for a moment, before drifting downward. It locked onto me. The reaction was instantaneous. The steady beep of the heart monitor violently spiked. Beep, 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 beep. A gurgling, panicked sound caught in the plastic tubing of his throat. His remaining facial muscles twitched frantically, pulling his mouth into a grotesque, slanting grimace of sheer terror. He couldn't move his arms. He couldn't shift his legs. He couldn't even turn his neck more than a fraction of an inch. But his eyes were screaming. He recognized me. He remembered the rain. He remembered the diner. And looking at my calm, unbothered posture, the absolute lack of surprise or pity on my face, the realization finally snapped into place behind his panicked, trapped eyes. He knew I had let him do it. He knew I hadn't fought for the keys. He knew I hadn't warned him about the brakes. He realized in that sterile, putrid room that his grand, tragic accident wasn't a stroke of terrible luck. It was an execution by omission, and I had been the one to sign the warrant. The monitor shrieked its warning alarm. A nurse in blue scrubs hurried past me, checking the vitals, adjusting a dial on the machine, ignoring the silent, frantic screaming of the patient trapped beneath the sheets. Just a panic spike. The nurse sighed, tapping the screen. Happens sometimes. His brain still fires distress signals to a nervous system that doesn't work. Poor bastard. Yeah. I said quietly, my voice perfectly level. Poor bastard. I didn't step closer. I didn't lean in to whisper a final cinematic one-liner. I didn't need to. The complete, utter impotence of his rage was all the closure I required. He was buried alive inside his own skull, completely aware of his ruin, unable to run, unable to lie, unable to charm his way out of a single agonizing second of his sentence. I looked at him one last time. I let my eyes trace the ruined lines of his face, burning the image into my memory to overwrite the ghost of the man who had haunted my first life. Then I turned my back on him. I walked out of room 412, the frantic, elevated beeping of his heart monitor fading behind me with every step. I pushed through the heavy metal fire doors of the annex and stepped out into the biting October wind. The sky was the color of bruised iron threatening snow. I zipped up my coat, shoving my hands deep into my pockets. My fingers brushed against my set of apartment keys. The metal was cold, solid, and real. Karma had finished its work. The debt was settled, paid in blood-shattered bone and frozen bank accounts. But as I walked across the cracked asphalt toward the bus stop, the harsh wind biting at my cheeks, I knew the truth. Surviving the fire didn't make me pure. It just made me ash and scar tissue. I wasn't a hero. I was just a woman walking in the cold, finally breathing free air. And for today, that was going to have to be enough. Snow began to fall in mid-November, thick, heavy flakes that turned the city's grim architecture into something soft and muted. The radiators in the basement of the community college hissed and clanked, smelling of scorching dust and peeling paint. I sat at a scarred wooden table in the back of the library, methodically sweeping grey eraser shavings into a neat little pile with the edge of my hand. I was taking an evening course in forensic accounting. It was a deeply cynical choice, maybe even a little masochistic. But after spending a lifetime paying for a financial crime, I didn't understand. I wanted to know the language. I wanted to know how the gears turned, how the loopholes were threaded, and how men like Tristan hid their rot behind columns of numbers. The textbook was heavy, the pages glossy and smelling faintly of chemical binding glue. The library was mostly empty, populated only by exhausted people looking for a second chance after the world had chewed them up. We were a quiet, invisible tribe. "Hey, Sadie." I looked up. David, a guy from my Tuesday night lecture, was hovering near the edge of my table. He was in his 30s, wearing a faded mechanic's jacket that smelled faintly of motor oil and cold wind. He held a crumpled syllabus in his fist, looking utterly defeated. "I can't get the balance sheet to reconcile," David muttered, dropping his notebook onto the table. The professor said something about shell asset depreciation, but it just looks like imaginary money to me. "It is imaginary," I said, my voice quiet, lacking the bright, eager pitch of a normal 24-year-old. I pulled his notebook toward me. The handwriting was messy, frustrated. "But the IRS doesn't care if it's imaginary. They care where you wrote it down." I picked up my mechanical pencil and tapped the graphite against a column of numbers he had crossed out. "You're treating the offshore holding like a tangible asset." I explained, the words tasting strange on my tongue. "You have to move it to the liability column first, bleed the depreciation, and then wash it back through the parent company's operational losses. That hides the cash." David stared at me, then down at the paper. He blinked, doing the mental math. A slow whistle escaped his teeth. "Jesus, that's practically stealing." "No," I corrected flatly, handing the notebook back. "Stealing is when you break a window and take a television. This is asset management. The window stays intact, but the house belongs to the bank by morning." He gave me a long, searching look. "Where did you learn to do that?" "I had a very bad teacher," I said. I didn't elaborate, and David didn't press. People in night school didn't dig into each other's pasts. We all had them. He offered a tired, genuine smile, thanked me, and walked back to his table. I watched him go, feeling a strange, unfamiliar tightness in my chest. It wasn't anxiety. It was connection. a tiny, fragile thread tying me back to the human race. I wasn't just a ghost haunting my own timeline anymore. I was sitting in a warm room helping a mechanic pass a test. The sheer boring normalcy of it was staggering. 2 hours later, the librarian flicked the overhead lights to signal closing time. The fluorescent bulbs buzzed aggressively in protest. I packed my bag, the zipper loud in the quiet room, and headed out into the winter night. The cold hit me, instantly biting at my nose and cheeks. The snow was sticking to the pavement now, crunching softly beneath my boots. I walked past a corner bodega. A stack of evening newspapers sat on a wire rack outside, partially covered in a thin layer of snow. I stopped. The headline wasn't blaring across the front page. It was tucked away in a small black and white column near the bottom fold, fighting for space with local sports scores and supermarket ads. Hayes matriarch accepts plea deal in fraud case. I brushed a dusting of snow off the paper with my gloved thumb. The article was barely 100 words. Beatrice had pleaded guilty to 2 counts of tax evasion and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. To avoid a lengthy, humiliating trial, she had surrendered her remaining assets and accepted a 3-year sentence at a minimum security federal camp. The Oak and Iron Financial Group was officially dissolved, its assets liquidated to pay back a fraction of what was stolen. It was over. The empire was gone. I stood under the flickering neon light of the bodega awning, waiting for the surge of triumph. I waited for the vindictive joy to rush through my veins, to warm me against the freezing wind. But there was nothing. No fireworks. No dramatic crescendo. Just the dull, heavy realization that Beatrice was going to sleep on the same thin, scratchy mattress I had slept on. She was going to eat the same terrible food smell, the same industrial cleaner, and watch the clock tick away her golden years in a room she couldn't leave. The system she had weaponized against me had finally turned its cold, mechanical jaws on her. I let the newspaper drop back onto the stack. I didn't even buy a copy. Turning my collar up against the wind, I kept walking. The streetlights cast long yellow pools on the fresh snow. I realized somewhere around the 3rd block that my lungs didn't hurt. The freezing air didn't trigger a coughing fit. The phantom ache in my chest, the terrifying muscle memory of my hospice bed, had quietly vanished over the last few weeks without me noticing. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and took a deep, greedy breath. The air tasted like ozone-wet pavement and snow. It was freezing harsh and perfectly clean. I was 24 years old. I had $70 in my checking account, a cheap apartment above a dry cleaner, and a midterm exam on Thursday. I had no family, no friends, and a past that belonged in a horror movie. But the road ahead of me was blank. It was completely, terrifyingly empty. And for the first time in 20 years, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I shoved my hands deep into my pockets, lowered my head against the falling snow, and started the long walk home. Revenge isn't a blazing fire that keeps you warm. Sometimes it's just the quiet satisfaction of letting the snow bury the wreckage. Sadie finally walked away, leaving the monsters to their own cages, and chose to rebuild a life out of the ashes. What did you think of her journey? Was her silence the ultimate punishment, or would you have done things differently? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a dark redemption arc, and don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next story.